Hi everyone, it's Rod Ellison. I thought I'd take a stab at sharing a step-by-step on how to perform light mapping and baking for your Nowhere World projects. Now, to set up our project for light mapping, the first thing we need to do is download an HDRI file. And these come from places on the internet like Polyhaven. You can go on and find a HDRI that kind of matches the environmental lighting and the ambient light that your project's going to need. And then take whatever that file is over to Babylon, drag and drop it, and the output of that will be an environmental file. Now the next thing we want to do with this newly downloaded HDR file is get it in the project so that it's used to help with the lighting that we're going to use for our mapping. And to get it included, we need to come over here to the Properties panel, select the World Properties, and make sure that we're using nodes. Now once we use those nodes, we can go to Shading and go to the World object, and essentially these are the nodes that I'm using. Here's the main texture node, which is a environmental texture, so it's not an image texture, it's an environmental texture with a mapping node in front of it and a texture coordinate. And this mapping node allows you to rotate the HDRI as you need, or whatever is going to match your scene, so that the sun and things in the image are in the right location relative to your scene. Now with that info behind us, we can finally get into the detailed steps for making Lightmap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select my stage canopy, as this will be its own light mapped object. I want to keep this separate from the ground plane and the stage. And I'm going to go to the Shading tab here, pulling up this material. And with this, you can see the elements, the base color, and the normal map. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new texture, an image texture. And this ultimately is going to be the texture that we bake the light map to. So I'm going to create a new texture. I'm going to call it Stage Canopy Baked for right now. This one's, I'm going to keep this very high, 2048 by 2048. It does not need to have an alpha, and I have a black background. So I have a material here that I can ultimately write to, an image that I can ultimately write to. But one of the things I'm going to need to do, because I have overlapping original material textures here, is I'm going to need to create a new UV, a secondary UV. So I'm going to go to the secondary UV, create Stage Canopy Baked, and the selected item in the UV map on this panel is the one that is ultimately active. So with this active, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to UV Editing, and I'm going to create a new UV layout. I don't want overlapping UVs like here, because I need to write every pixel of this light mapped image to its own pixel in the texture map. So I'm going to select all the items in my original file here, and I'm going to create a new UV, Smart UV Project, with a little bit of island margin and area weight. And you can see that all the faces get aligned to this new texture, aligned for this UV map. So I've selected this one. This is the texture I'm baking to. And at this point, I can go back to my shading, click this, and go to your Render tab, which is the Render Properties tab over here. And if you're in Cycles mode, scroll down to where you see Bake. And you want to bake with the combined type. So this is going to bake essentially the shadows, the light, the textures, all into one map. So if I pull this up over here, my Stage Canopy Baked, it doesn't look like anything right now, but if I click the Bake, and with a little fast forwarding, you can see that the baked texture was output to this texture, and you can see essentially all the textures with the shadows kind of baked right into them, and that's what it's all about. And now the last thing I need to do before I can use this is go back into my Nowhere plugin settings and create missing GLTF nodes right here. It puts this little node out here. And I'm going to hook up this light map to this setting right here in the GLTF. And now when I deploy my GLTF project and pull it up into the bake test, And now what I have in the world is a nicely textured and baked lighting. You can see shadows now right here and all here. These weren't here before, right? So now it's incorporating rendered lighting and shadows into the textures I'm putting in my world objects. So back in Blender, essentially we could deal with these other objects similarly, like the stage. But one thing that gets tricky is when you have large areas like this, like the ground, that have repeating textures. You can't essentially Lightmap bake this texture into a Lightmap without making it very pixelated and ruining all the detail. So this is one technique I use to deal with these, because ultimately these are the shadows that you want right here, you know, all these nice little lines right here. But you don't want to bake those into a Lightmap with this texture. So here's a technique to use for that. We're going to duplicate the large ground object and call it shadow plane. And we're going to set that to be just a little higher than the ground itself. So this is literally sitting just a small bit above the ground. We're going to get rid of the original material, but we're going to create a material that we call shadow plane. Right? So this is basically a blank material at this point, and like before, like our other light mapping, we need to add an input texture, an image texture, and this is going to be a new, we're going to call it shadow plane, and this needs to be, you know, large enough to encompass this area, but it also needs to be an alpha. And to ultimately set this up properly, we need to ensure a few properties in our shader is correct. That is, we need to make it sure it's almost 100% rough with no specular, and we need to make sure that the display settings are essentially alpha blend, no opaque. And lastly, as far as UV editing, we need to make sure that our entire object, the entire ground shadow plane, fits within this object that we're going to have be our light map for this ground plane. And finally, we can go back to our shading tab, make sure our shadow plane's clicked, go to rendering, and bake. And after a little fast forwarding, this is the resulting image you have. And you can kind of see the opaqueness and the shadows, but we need to save this off because we need to manipulate it a little bit first before we can use it. So I've switched over to GIMP, which is a lot like Adobe Photoshop, and I like this because it's got one key easy to use feature, which is color to alpha. So what I'm going to do with this image, which makes up my shadow plane, is I'm going to first actually turn it to grayscale to get rid of any of the color to it, and then I'm going to run the color to alpha to get rid of all the white. And lastly, I'm going to do a little curve adjustment to make the shadows just a little bit darker by adjusting the alpha. And lastly, I'll save this back out to the original directory. And now, if I hook this up, and reload the image, and lastly export it, I'll reopen the project in the World Runner, and now you can see these nice little shadows down here at the bottom and in the back. And that's basically how you create large-scale shadows. So you can tweak this a little bit. You can see a little white, reduce some softening, do some tricks in GIMP, but that's how you get shadows on large ground planes.